Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next webinar in our series on annexation or extension of sovereignty. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us today. We're here at a new hour and very excited to welcome all of you today. I'm Lisa Armoni, and I'm the director of the Rose Project at Jewish Federation of Orange County. This is now our fifth webinar on this series, in which we seek to provide an educational platform on this important and controversial issue by bringing in a range of voices and examining it through different perspectives. Today, we're going to look through the lens of Palestinian and Arab stakeholders in the region and build our understanding of how this issue is perceived by them and the possible ramifications it may have for dynamics in the Middle East. Just a couple of words about the Rose Project. The Rose Project is a division of Jewish Federation of Orange County, which is a resource for Israel education in our Jewish community and in our broader community. Our programs seek to engage the community across the age spectrum. When dealing with a subject on which there are strong differences of opinion, we believe in providing an educational platform and a platform for values-based discourse. While we don't necessarily seek to take positions on particular issues, we believe it's important to understand these issues in all of their dimensions. Our explorations are therefore based on the idea that by hearing diverse views, we add to our own knowledge as we learn from one another. This way, we not only grow, but we also have the ability to remain in community with one another despite any disagreements. And we know, of course, that these values are deeply ingrained in our own Jewish tradition. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you've been with us in the past, you've heard this before, so bear with me. For those of you who are new, I want to make sure you know. At any time during the webinar, you can submit questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your control panel. Our guest and I are going to have a conversation today, and afterwards I'll be incorporating your questions, or at least as many as I can, into the dialogue. I'm gonna do my best to incorporate as many questions as I can as time allows. If I don't get to your question, I apologize. Usually we get quite a few. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be happy to share the link upon its completion. And you'll find the link to this webinar as well as to our previous webinars on our website, www.jewishoc.org. In addition, we are live streaming on Facebook right now. And so I'm delighted right now to introduce our speaker. A lawyer by training, Ghaith al-Omari is currently a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And he is with the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. Ghaith has extensive experience in the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. He was an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team throughout the permanent status negotiations from 1999 to 2001. In that capacity, he participated in various negotiating rounds, most notably the Camp David Summit and the Taba talks. After the breakdown of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative, which was an unofficial model peace agreement negotiated between leading Palestinian and Israeli public figures. Ghaith, we're thrilled that you're here to share your insights with us today, and I'm going to welcome you to our Zoom call and to open your video and your audio. There you are. Thank you. So I thought perhaps we could start off with you providing us with an overview of the current situation in the Palestinian Authority and in Gaza, particularly as it pertains to this debate around annexation or sovereignty extension, as some people are calling it.
First of all, thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for everyone in the Federation, and of course for everyone who's attending. It's really an honor and a pleasure. As I told you earlier, my only complaint is that I cannot be there in person, but we'll have to do with what we have right now. So what I will try to do in a very short period now is to maybe give you a snapshot of where things stand today. This is a dynamic, fluid situation, but I'll try to describe what I see the state of play right now. Of course, it's much more complicated, and if nothing else, by the fact that we actually don't know what we're talking about. We talk about annexation in theory, how big, how small, is it going to happen, is it not going to happen? So a lot of what I'm going to be describing is also happening in a context of uncertainty. But in general, I would say that opposition to annexation is maybe the only thing right now that all Palestinians, whether it's the Palestinian Authority, whether it's Hamas, or whether it's the Palestinian public, they all agree on that. The vast majority, and we've seen this in many polls, that the vast majority, more than 90% of the public are against it. And of course, so are the Palestinian governments in the West Bank and in Gaza. Yet the fact that they are against it doesn't mean that they are united. And each of these three actors are actually approaching it from in a different way and based on different considerations. So let me start with the Palestinian Authority. For the Palestinian Authority, annexation is an existential threat. The Palestinian Authority has actually, one reason for existence, and that reason, at least that's the way it presents itself to the Palestinian public. The Palestinian Authority was created as a transitional body to move the Palestinians from occupation to statehood using diplomacy. If annexation happens, it will be seen as the death of a two-state solution, and therefore the Palestinian Authority will really have no reason to exist, and its very foundation will be undermined. They are worried, and they've already taken steps to show that they are concerned, and the steps primarily, two sets of steps. One is the usual diplomatic action, going to the UN, going to the Europeans, etc., where they've been.
Rafe, if you can hear me, I think you froze. I don't know if there's a problem with your internet connection.
Sorry, are we back on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Pardon me. So I was saying the Palestinian Authority, basically the reaction to this has basically been to cut all relations with Israel, to cut security cooperation, but also to cut civilian relations, meaning the Palestinian Authority is no longer even receiving the tax transfers that Israel gets on its behalf. Now, the reason why the PA is doing this, it's doing this to send a message to Israel that things are serious, and almost to give the Israeli, at least establishment, a glimpse into the abyss of how things would be if there is annexation. Yet, every Palestinian official that I've spoken to recently is very clear that they have no clear plan of what to do if there is annexation. We might expect more of the same, but they do know that things might spin out of their control. So that's the Palestinian Authority on the one hand. For Hamas, Hamas is in a different position. Of course, Hamas is against it, but Hamas, in many ways, is more comfortable than the PA. For Hamas, annexation is almost no big deal in the sense that, as far as they're concerned, Tel Aviv and the Jordan Valley are one and the same. They're all occupied territory. And in many ways, annexation is used by Hamas to reinforce its message. And its message is, Israel has no interest in peace. The message is the diplomacy and the Oslo process has always been a sham, and this is proof positive of the case. Now, Hamas will want, if there is annexation, to vocally respond, and it will do that probably by restarting some of the tensions that we saw the last few years on the borders. These weekly marches, weekly demonstrations create some tension, but they do not want things in Gaza to go into a full-out escalation. Hamas has a tacit understanding with Israel, which is security for loosening the closure. And Hamas has no interest in wide instability that might threaten the rule in Gaza. What they will try to do, and what they're already starting to try to do, is to inflame things in the West Bank, both rhetorically.
We've lost your audio.
I don't know, is it back on or?
Here we go. Yep, now we can hear you.
I'm terribly sorry about this. I'm in a new location, and I guess the internet's not that good. Pardon me. So Hamas will try to do is most likely to escalate in the West Bank while creating a degree of stability in Gaza. which brings me to the last point, which is the Palestinian public. And here it is very difficult to speak about the Palestinian public because, you know, especially in times of crisis, public opinion shifts all the time, and Palestinians are probably worse than Israelis. Put two Palestinians together, you have five opinions. Yet, what I see so far is while there is large um, rejection of annexation, we have not actually seen this being translated into public activity. The PA tried to call for some demonstrations. Very few people showed up. And there is a reason. If you look at the polls, most Palestinians do not trust their governments. They don't trust the Palestinian Authority and they don't trust Hamas. And they are afraid if they go out in demonstrations that they will pay the price and their leaders will actually not use that for their political benefit. So far, we're seeing a Palestinian public that is not particularly active. In addition to what I mentioned, the Palestinian public is also facing two more crises, related crises. One is COVID. Just like in Israel, we started to see, at least in the West Bank, a resurgence of COVID cases, and there is concern that actually the system is overwhelmed. And a combination of COVID and the Palestinian Authority's rejection or unwillingness to accept the money from Israel is creating a deep economic crisis. I'll conclude with this now. Many people look at the Palestinian public reaction and say, see, nothing is going to happen. And it's very possible that nothing is going to happen. Yet I am worried. I am worried because what I see is volatility. I don't predict that we will see a third intifada or mass violence, but I see enough anger and I see enough lack of control by political leadership that what I'm more worried about is, you know, a repeat of what we saw a few years ago of these lone wolf kinds of attacks. If we start seeing a wave of these, and I know that the Israeli security establishment is also worried about this, these are the kind of things that could trigger a much wider, much more widespread kind of uncertainty. So in conclusion, everyone's against it, but everyone's approached it in a different way. My main concern is actually, will the public remain passive, or will we start seeing a fraying of the current security situation?
So I want to take a couple of the things that you mentioned and unpack them a little bit more. And one of them is the security coordination that was implemented really as part of the Oslo process. Security coordination between the Israeli security forces and Palestinian Authority security forces, which many attribute to the significant decline in violence in the West Bank. And now, without even any concrete steps by the Israeli government, we've seen that coordination has broken down. And we know historically that Mahmoud Abbas has threatened to stop the security coordination, but has never actually taken the kinds of steps that we're seeing right now in terms of really almost complete breakdown. So I'd like to ask you, is this a significantly different situation right now, or different than any kind of other challenges in the past where there have been threats? And also, what are the potential ramifications for a lack of security coordination?
Thank you. It is definitely different. As you yourself mentioned, Abbas had threatened many times in the past to sever security cooperation. He always pulled back. This time, they did cut the security coordination, I think, in order to send a message, a clear message to the Israelis that there is not business as usual as we have it, but also in response to public domestic pressure to do something. Now, I worked for Abbas for many years, and I have many criticisms of him, and many of these will come through in our conversation. But one thing I can say with great certainty is that he is against violence. So when he cut the security coordination, what happened is he also said that the Palestinian security forces will continue doing the same functions that they did before. They continue to go after Hamas. They continue to do law and order, etc., etc. And while there is no coordination, I think there is communication, not directly, but through an American agency that's there. There is an American official mission called the U.S. Security Coordinator, a 3-star general that's been on the ground since, I think, 2006. And he is doing, a tremendous guy. He is doing a lot of the kind of back-to-back coordination. So things so far have been going close to normal, yet there is a threat and there is a concern. Look, I mean, security coordination has been going on for quite a while, and both sides know what they need to do, and both sides have fallen into, a pattern where they know how to react. So as long as things are routine, I am not worried. The concern is if you have a crisis. For example, one of the functions in the past has always been if there is an Israeli who strays into a Palestinian town, the Palestinian security forces grabs the person, hands them over to the Israelis, and things run smoothly. If this happens today and things start going bad and there's no communication, things must spin out of control. So my worry is not if the things are routine, but if there's a crisis, then the routine will not be able to respond to these crises.
Okay. Well, thank you. And now I want to talk about some of the things that you mentioned and their impact on the popular level. I mean, you mentioned that there's a breakdown in the civilian aspect of the coordination, particularly with regard to taxes. And I know that there's concern. I think the United Nations has expressed concern that the Palestinian Authority may run out of money by September. And also, recently, the Palestinian Authority rejected medical aid that was delivered by the UAE through Israel. We know there were some political issues there, but the end result is that the Palestinian people didn't get badly needed medical aid. So I'm wondering, from a popular level, if moves like this, decisions by the Palestinian Authority, could further inflame tensions at the grassroots level, and what might be the result of that.
And absolutely. I mean, look, one of the main concerns that I have in this period is that it's happening at a time where the Palestinian Authority has really lost a lot of its legitimacy and its credibility with its own public. If you look at opinion polls, around 80% of the Palestinians believe that their governments are corrupt, around 70% want Abbas to step down. So the Palestinian Authority itself does not have the, if you wish, moral and political capital to control its own public. Now, add to this what you mentioned, an economic crisis, people going without pay. Add to that the issue of COVID. And this is where things really start getting nervous, worrying. The public, by the way, this is not the first time that the Palestinian Authority decided not to take money from Israel. They did it a couple of years ago over a different issue, and the public was against that move. And in the end, the Palestinian Authority had to walk back that decision. This time they did this, and they thought that the Arab countries or some European countries will come and bail them out. No one is doing that, and they will probably have to pull back. But all of these kind of decisions that are unthought through end up chipping the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, and the increase of the worsening of the economic situation creates more sense of concern. And this is, again, what I think the Israeli security folks are worried about. And this is why, for example, we saw Israel take an unprecedented move of allowing Palestinian workers to go and to go to Israel and stay there overnight, which is not usually the case because they're worried about that. About the UAE shipment, that's a very specific issue, and it relates not to COVID or going through Israel or anything of the sort. The Palestinian Authority is accepting a lot of aid that's coming through Israel, the Qataris and others. Abbas has a very bad relationship with the Emirati Crown Prince, MBZ. It has nothing to do with this. It has something to do with a totally different issue. And this is part of the tension between the different leaderships. And that's one of the problems of Abbas's rule. He has actually mismanaged many of his Arab relations, whether with the Emiratis, the Egyptians, even the Jordanians, who are now their closest ally. And these are the kind of things that, again, do not reflect well on the public. And again, anecdotally, there's no polling on this. Some folks that I've spoken to recently are saying, why should Abbas follow his feud when we pay the price? So this all adds to this kind of very combustible mix that we see right now.
Okay. I want to ask about Abbas in particular with regard to his tenure. We know that he's been in office, I think it's about 12 years now, and he's probably nearing the end of his presidency. At least that's what the speculation is. And yet he hasn't really prepared the ground for succession. And we're hearing different potential successors, whether it's Shataya or it's Jibril Rajoub, expressing different preferences for how the PA should respond to this whole issue. And so I'd like you to address that. To what extent are we seeing potential succession power plays in terms of the way that the Palestinian Authority is responding in this moment?
I mean, you're absolutely right. Everything right now, politically speaking, succession drives almost every political action that we see now from Palestinian senior leaders. And look, no one would, let's say, no one is going to become the next president on the force of being accommodating and moderate, etc. When you have a political contest, everyone tries to prove that they are a hardline, that their credentials and all of that. Now, by the way, I know most of these folks, and I don't think any of them is interested in violence or instability. But the political messaging that they do always ends up being more hardline. So we see, for example, Shtaya, the current prime minister, a potential successor, pushing the diplomatic agenda so far that he had to be reined in by Abbas himself, who told him, you're pushing too far. You might be pushing us off the brink. Now, Shtaya is not doing that because he wants to create a crisis, because he wants to show that he is tough. On the other hand, we see someone like Rajoub, who's another potential successor, who I know is very much against Hamas, and he was the guy in charge of dismantling the Hamas infrastructure in the 90s, suddenly leading the charge to have a reconciliation, quote unquote, with Hamas. So this lack of clarity about succession, add to it the annexation and the public rejection to it, creates these kinds of dynamics where no Palestinian leader will now feel any political need or value in taking a more moderate position. And I would add to this, if there is annexation and if there is succession, then the next president will face a very difficult position. He will be, and it will be a he, unfortunately, there are no women who are contenders. He will have to show himself to be tough, yet maintain security at a time when he is most vulnerable. So I think even as you look at the political implications of succession, some of them relate to how the leaders are acting now, but some might carry into the post-succession and might actually undermine any next president and their ability to control and to maintain security on the ground.
Fascinating. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about public opinion. And I'm going to reference here Peter Beinart's article last week. He issued a very interesting, controversial piece. And I don't really want to get into the nature of his argument, but one of the things he talks about in making the case for one state solution is he says that there is a tremendous support for a one state solution among Palestinians, and particularly among young Palestinians. And I wonder if you could speak to this notion. If you're seeing increased support among Palestinians for a one state solution compared as opposed to a two state solution, and also what does it mean through a Palestinian lens to have a one state solution? I'm not sure that the way Israelis look at the possibility of one state and the way Palestinians look at it is the same. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure. I mean, look, one of the, I think, criticisms that Peter received from many Israelis was, this is not an Israeli conversation. This is an American conversation, but Israelis do not have this kind of conversation. And the same is true about Palestinians. You talk to many Palestinian Americans, particularly activists on campus or whatnot, and you will see a lot of support for the one state. By the way, I don't call it a solution. Because it's not a solution. Yet, if you go to the Palestinians themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, there is very, very little support for that. Maybe among some of the elites in Ramallah, you might find some support. But if you look at public opinion polling, what we see is an interesting trend. On the one hand, there is definitely a loss of support for the two-state solution. I think most Palestinians right now believe it's not achievable. Now, most Palestinians blame Israel for that, but either way, whichever the reason is, most Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza do not believe that a two-state solution is possible. Yet, none of them actually believes that, or a very small minority, supports a one-state outcome for a simple reason, because they know it is not possible. Because for exactly the reason that you mentioned, Lisa, when we talk about, you see Israelis and Palestinians talk about a one state, yet what they mean is very, very different. A one state for many Israelis, and by the way, this is not only in the left where Peter is, but also on the right. This is where many on the right are. For them, this new state is this one state is still a Jewish state where Hebrew is the main language, Hatikva is the national anthem, etc., but it has some Palestinians in it. Now, talk to Palestinians, they will tell you, oh, the new one state will be a Palestinian state where the language is Arabic and the national anthem is Fida'i, etc. And this is why Palestinians who are away from Palestine in the diaspora thinks that makes sense. If you're a Palestinian who knows Israelis, who knows Israel, which most West Bankers and Gazans do, they understand that this is not something that Israel will ever accept. And you see in this situation where you see Palestinians losing faith in a two-state solution, but not going for a one-state option. What they go for right now is something totally different. Most Palestinians, especially the young, are checked out. And that makes me worried because you might be checked out. And we've seen many instances in the past where, disengagement very quickly can turn into anger and into action. And if you look at some of the research done by mainly Israelis on that lone wolf phenomenon, much of the people who were engaged in this did it out of a sense of revenge and a lack of direction. So what we're seeing right now is exactly that, a lack of direction, but it's by no means replaced by a one-state agenda, because most Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza realize that this is even more unlikely and more and less achievable than a two-state solution.
Very interesting, and I appreciate you're making the distinction between a diaspora conversations and the conversations that are actually being held, in the region by people on the ground. And I think sometimes we in the diaspora can lose sight of that. So I really appreciate your calling that out. I want to talk about something that we've heard on some of these webinars is that perhaps one of the underlying messages of the Trump plan and the conditions that it lays out is that it's trying to send a message to Palestinians that they're running out of time, right? That the Trump plan is perceived by many as offering Israel much more than earlier plans, and potentially offering Palestinians less than previous plans, and it's very intentionally so. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Are Palestinians seeing or understanding that message the way that some are interpreting that?
No. The short answer is no. I mean, if this is the message that the administration wants to send, then the message is not reaching. For a reason. Actually, for a number of reasons. I mean, one reason is actually, I believe, that the administration has overreached. An anecdote. I was speaking to a Gulf Arab official a few days before the unveiling of this plan, and that person actually was mirroring what you said. The Palestinians always say no, they should learn, and he was willing to actually support it. Then a few days later, we saw the release, and the guy saw this, and I was talking to him again, and he was like, "I cannot support this. No Arab can support this." I think the map that and the whole plan that was presented was such a radical departure and was so one-sided that even those who were sympathetic to putting some pressure on the Palestinians found it impossible to support it. Now, what this meant in practical terms is that when the Palestinians went to the Arab League to get support from the Arab League, they got unanimous support. When they went to the Europeans, they got unanimous support. Went to the UN, got unanimous support, or near unanimous. So from the Palestinian, if you're sitting in Ramallah, what you see is an American plan that's only endorsed by the US and Israel, and the rest of the world is supporting them. And I think many of them are looking at our November elections to see if there is a new Trump administration, then they might have to start engaging this in a more significant way. If there is a Biden administration, then they know very well that this plan will be off the table. So I think, again, by overreaching, this message, which is shared, by the way, by, again, many Arabs, not only Israelis, this message was totally lost, and the Palestinians managed to take control of the whole diplomatic situation and to actually isolate diplomatically the US and Israeli positions.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna pull the lens back now a little bit and talk about the wider Arab region. And the first thing is, we talked about Palestinian public opinion. I'd like to ask you a question about public opinion in the broader Arab world with regard to annexation, and specifically, particularly in light of the fact that a couple of things, actually. First, we're seeing a warming of relations between Israel and the Gulf states. And so how might annexation impact public opinion there, and how might that impact this trend that we see in the relations? I also want to address the issue of Jordan, because we know how important the Israeli-Jordanian relationship is. And we heard last week in a webinar the degree to which King Abdullah is getting pressure on the one hand internally, but on the other hand, the importance of really preserving the many ties that Jordan has with Israel in terms of security, in terms of resources, etc. So I'd like to ask you about the broader region, and I'm also going to give a little plug that you're going to be participating in a panel that addresses public opinion in the Arab world, and I'm going to be happy to share that link with our participants so they can hear an even deeper dive on this issue.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the plug in particular. And I missed some of what you said. Sorry, my connection is not stable. But if I missed something in my answer, please let me know. I mean, so let me start maybe with the Gulf, and then move to Jordan, and a bit about both of them. So look, I mean, the Gulf, you rightly said, there's been a thawing in relationships, some more visible than others, some is under the table. As my colleague David Makowski likes to say, this table is becoming so crowded, under the table is starting to levitate. It's the worst kept secret in the Middle East. Yet, I would urge everyone who hasn't done so yet to actually read an op-ed that was written by the United Arab Emirates ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Utaiba. Yusuf wrote this op-ed in Yadiot Ahronot in Hebrew. And the message is the following, and I think he sums up the Gulf position when it comes to this. He made it very clear why his country wants to have good relations with Israel, running the whole spectrum from security to desal to economy to regional integration to anti-Iran, the whole thing. So he was very clear, and I think he honestly said what many Gulfis think, that they have a lot to gain from Israel and they want to have this relationship. Yet he also said that if annexation happens, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for these countries to maintain these relations with Israel. And there is a reason for that, two reasons. One reason is much of the, again, rapprochement that we're seeing right now, the thawing, is premised on the idea of a two-state solution. The two-state solution idea, it's one of the more interesting transformation in collective Arab thinking, from the three no's in 1968, where the Arab leaders meeting in Khartoum, Sudan, said no to normalization, no to negotiation, and no to recognition, to 2002, when they met some of the same leaders, actually, when they met in Beirut in 2002, said, we're willing as an Arab world to engage with Israel, to recognize Israel, normalize with Israel, if there's a two-state solution. I mean, I'm simplifying, but this is basically the message. And this is how they built their whole approach. The UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, the three main countries that we're talking about here, believe that annexation will end the two-state solution and will end the fundamental, logical, if you wish, underpinnings of their relations with Israel. But there's a more immediate and more practical, more concrete reason, is that they are worried that if there's annexation and they continue the relations with Israel, they will be vulnerable. They know for a fact that their opponents, whether it's Iran or Turkey, Iran from the Shia side and Turkey from the Muslim Brotherhood side, will use their relations with Israel against them. particularly during annexation, we're seeing it already. Open Al Jazeera, that's the Qatari news site, and it's all attacks on UAE and on Saudi, and they know it'll be more vulnerable, and they also know their publics will be against it, which to me was counterintuitive, because what we hear often is that the public no longer cares about the Palestinian issue. I was actually today reading an unpublished poll, probably to be published next week, that said that 80% in the United Arab Emirates of the public think that opening relations with Israel before resolving the Palestinian-Israeli issue is unadvisable. So these Gulf leaders were worried of their own public reactions. The two of these mean that if you have annexation, expect a very big price to be paid. For Jordan, it's different. For Jordan, annexation is a national security issue. By the way, not only because around 60, 70% of the Jordanian citizens are of Palestinian origin. Interestingly, much of the opposition to annexation is coming from quote unquote East Bankers, people of former military, the current Speaker of Parliament, people of this sort, because they see a major existential threat. And the threat, because the Jordanians believe if there's no two-state solution, then the idea of Jordan is Palestine might be revived. And they look at some Israeli voices, including someone who was defense minister until recently, Naftali Bennett, who says Jordan is Palestine. And the Jordanians are less worried about the short-term stability because they know how to manage their own system and their own street. They're worried more in the strategic long-term. The death of a two-state solution might be the death of Jordan. And obviously they will be against it. And therefore, while they don't want to jeopardize their relations with Israel, the strategic ones, security, water, and energy, they will act, and they will act robustly in downgrading the diplomatic relations and in leading, I think, the Arab and international diplomatic effort against annexation.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to go now to some questions that are coming in from participants. Okay, so we actually have a question from one of our board members who's asking, why is Hamas approaching Gaza and the West Bank differently?
For a very simple reason. Hamas is the ruling party, is the ruling power in Gaza, the de facto government in Gaza. And they do not want to have instability there. They know that if there is another round escalation, another war with Israel, their rule in Gaza might be threatened. And the current Hamas leader in particular, a guy by the name of Yahya Sinwar, has managed to indirectly, through Egyptian mediators, to reach an understanding with Israel. So he's reined back some of the demonstrations and clashes that we used to see. Interestingly, over the last year and a half, hardly any rockets being fired from within Gaza, because Hamas has become, like any government, invested in the stability of the ground. So they will do everything that they can to make sure that their rule is not threatened, and they know that another war or a reimposition of the very harsh form of the closure that we saw before might undermine their stability. For them, the West Bank is very different. They've always eyed the West Bank. They've always wanted to be the primary player in the West Bank. The PA's security work, the PA's still some popularity that it has, security coordination, all of that has made it very difficult for Hamas to have inroads into the West Bank. And Hamas now sees a period of potential instability as a way of undermining the Palestinian Authority. They know if there's another intifada, the PA will pay the price. They know if...
We've lost your audio again, I'm afraid. Ghaith, we've lost your audio.
I'm sorry.
There you are. Okay.
So let me repeat the last bit. Hamas has been eyeing the West Bank for a while, and they see the potential instability in the West Bank as an opportunity to undermine and ultimately destroy the Palestinian Authority. And if the Palestinian Authority falls, then Hamas becomes the only, the last man standing, as it were. And so they have every desire to actually do that. And so far, what they're not hearing from Israel is the threat that if you escalate in the West Bank, you will pay the price in Gaza. And as long in their mind, as they can separate the two, maintain stability and their grip on Gaza, and at the same time destabilize the West Bank, and ultimately maybe become the only player there, the more that they will actually keep on going in that direction.
Okay, and I think that raises another question that people have asked about the potential role of Iran here, and the nature of the relationship between Hamas and Iran, and whether we're seeing Iranian activity in this sort of inter-Palestinian dynamics.
Not really, not really. I mean, look, Hamas has always had relations with Iran, and the relations were never interrupted between the military wing of Hamas and Iran. Yet the political wing has many tensions with Iran. We have to remember that Iran is a Shia country, and Hamas is a Sunni organization. And while you can kind of, mask over these differences, at a time when these tensions are very high region-wide, it's very difficult. Hamas has to play these kind of, walk this very tight rope of doing this, and so far it has decided to distance itself from Iran. The concern is not Hamas. The concern is a smaller organization called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is actually a proxy of Iran's, very much like Hezbollah in Lebanon. So far, Hamas has actually managed to keep the Islamic Jihad under control, both a mixture of security measures, but also political co-optation. But recently, we're starting to hear actually more and more vocal signals from the Islamic Jihad. They might start acting. There was a couple of... I
lost you again. No, we're not able to hear you. Right? Oh, okay.
Is it back on now?
Yes, and we lost you for about 30 seconds.
So again, the threat, if I may repeat, is not Hamas itself, because it maintains a degree of independence from Iran, but it's Islamic Jihad, which is a traditional proxy. And we are already starting to see indications that they might have a desire to escalate a bit further.
There's a question about Palestinian youth, and particularly with regard to what you talked about, this sort of disengagement. And the question is more of a long-term view. If you see this kind of generational difference, what this might be a harbinger for in terms of resolution of the conflict or continuation of the conflict. Do you have any way of sort of making a prediction? I know analysts like to predict, but
you asked me probably one of the questions that I struggle most with, because on the one hand, when I'm in my more pessimistic moments, I look at the trends, I look at some of what these young people are saying, and it reminds me exactly of what I used to say and what my generation used to say back in the 1970s and 80s. And I fear that they have to make the exact same mistakes that we made to get to the same conclusion that we reached. The conclusion that my generation reached was after we and the Israelis, both sides, we tried everything we could to eliminate the other. Violence, diplomacy, narrative. You remember when Golda Meir said no things like Palestinians. We would never say the word Israel. And with time, we understood that the only way to solve this conflict is through sharing the land. The Palestinians are going nowhere and the Israelis are going nowhere, and we have to reach a two-state solution. When I hear some of the young Palestinians, and by the way, sometimes some of the young Israelis these days, I fear that they might be doomed to make the same mistakes that we made. And unfortunately, these are not theoretical mistakes. These are not debating points. Sadly, the mistakes, unfortunately, will have to be paid for by blood from everyone and by suffering. So this is when I'm on my more pessimistic points, and this is why I feel so passionately about the need to rehabilitate the two-state solution, not by big ideas, but by concrete small actions that will reignite hope. On the other hand, when I'm on my more optimistic moments, and I have to say today I'm in a more optimistic mindset, my experience shows me that public opinion responds very quickly to credible, concrete promise of a change of the reality. We saw it with Oslo. A week before Oslo, the Palestinians and Israelis were in the middle of the first intifada. Once Oslo came out, public opinions shifted so very quickly. I saw it with the Gaza disengagement. Gazans were so opposed to Israel, and then we had the disengagement, and we had for a very short window, actually very positive views of Israel. So while I worry about public opinion, I see that public opinion can be changed if there is leadership. Now, if you really want me to tell you where I'm depressed, it's about leadership. Because I don't see leadership right now on the Palestinian side, and sadly not on the Israeli side, that will actually take these kinds of steps, that will maybe confront the skepticism and reignite hope. But if, with the right kind of leadership, I think public opinion, and we've seen this historically, can be shifted.
That's very interesting. I want to ask you a couple of things about that. One of them actually comes from one of the participants who was asking about what you see as the main obstacle or obstacles to resolving this conflict. And I wonder if you think it's leadership or if it's something else.
It is leadership. I mean, it's a bit more complicated because leadership in both places, Palestine and Israel, is a product of a public that is losing faith in peace, and understandably so. I mean, 25 years of failure, peppered with terrorism, violence, settlements, all of these things do add to this lack of faith. So they produce leaders who I think are themselves, whether Abbas or Netanyahu, are not leaders who are known for confronting their public opinions. So on the one hand, you have a public opinion that is moving away from resolution. On the other hand, you have leaders who are also not risk takers and leaders who are not confronting this public opinion. So you have this kind of dynamic. Yet again, I mean, I can tell you from my own experience, when you see leaders transform in the most unexpected ways, I mean, who would have thought that Ariel Sharon would have been the Israeli leader who will actually take Israel out of Gaza? But today, if I were to say, it's a combination of leaders who are sadly politically comfortable where they are, and publics who have no incentive whatsoever to push their leaders to take more advanced positions. Look, in some ways, I think with the current political atmosphere, it is impossible for me to think of a peace deal being struck anytime soon. The publics are not ready. The compromises that have to be made on both sides are too big. It doesn't mean that nothing can be done, though. A lot can be done, small steps. And here, the security coordination that we started talking about has made it possible to do certain steps in the West Bank in particular that will benefit the Palestinians, will show that there is forward momentum without endangering Israel's security. If we start building on this, if we start building on expanding security cooperation, if we start building on doing concrete steps that will allow Palestinian, two-staters to come to their public and say, yes, we're not going to have peace tomorrow, but we're moving towards peace. If we can start having a collaborative relationship where Palestinians can start seeing Israelis as potential partners and Israelis can start seeing Palestinians as potential partners, then maybe we can start shifting the direction. But if we go straight right now to trying to reach a peace deal, whether it is the Obama deal or the Trump deal, I just don't think that politics or the current leaders have the political capital or frankly the inclination to make such huge, far-reaching compromises. So maybe we should be more modest, but a bit more concrete.
Interesting. So I want to ask you another question, and you may have addressed this a little bit already, but you talk about the experience and the learning that people in your generation had to go through, this sort of learning journey, and where you are now compared to where you were at an earlier time in your life. It's interesting to think that there are people who hold that position in the context of pressure around anti-normalization with Israel. And how do you, as somebody who has had this journey, how do you reconcile the tension with pressures towards anti-normalization? What are some of the messages that you convey when you're engaging with Palestinians about how to navigate that?
Look, I mean, there are, I would say, maybe two sets of messages that I would actually, as I engage with Palestinians. One is to ask the very simple question. I mean, look, I understand, and by the way, I truly understand and sympathize by the sense of grievance and the sense of anger that many of the young Palestinians have. I mean, I lived in the West Bank for a long time. And I can tell you, it's not really pleasant to be living under the control of another nation. And so I understand the frustration, I understand all of that. But the main question, and I think the question that many Palestinian leaders have failed to ask their public is, how is this going to help you? How is anti-normalization going to help you? At the end of the day, to end the conflict and to end the occupation, you need the Israelis on board. And anti-normalization will only reinforce the worst sense among the Israelis. So really, I mean, in a sense, for some of these interlocutors that I have to uh, unpack their thinking and to move away from the anger that I think often leads to these sentiments to a more rational approach. Now, that doesn't work with everyone, because I do believe that there are some peoples, and you see this in the leadership of the BDS movement, for example, who are very committed to this anti-normalization, irrespective of what. But I think what we have often done is we've given up on many of the, rank and file, people who are sympathetic to anti-normalization, and I think we have not engaged them. So when I try to engage them, I try to get them to do this decoupling of the emotional reaction and the beneficial reaction. Now, it doesn't hurt me, frankly, and my case, when I say to them that the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank, in particular, Gaza is a different case, actually continue to normalize. If you look at how many Palestinians work in Israel, if you look, and this was to me personally, a personal, epiphany, if you wish, when I moved to Ramallah in 1998, to see that my neighbors who knew Israelis basically would tell you there are good Israelis, bad Israelis, like any other society, and yet they understood the complexity of Israel and that they have partners on the Israeli side. The fact that even in the West Bank right now, despite everything, still a majority engages with Israel makes a lot of what we hear from the anti-normalization movement in the diaspora, lose credibility. I would add only one thing to this. Look, it's easy for me to say this. At the end of the day, I say what I say. I go back to my home in DC, safe and secure that no one's gonna, impact me. What really gives me energy and hope, when I look at Palestinians and Israelis on the ground, having to basically confront anti-normalization, delegitimization that many Israelis see when they engage with Palestinians, and yet do it. It's the courage of these kind of folks that I think, first of all, we should support, and second, to me, gives me hope that ultimately leaders are emerging. But from my perspective, unless we continue fighting for coexistence and engagement, it doesn't mean easy conversations, but engagement. Unless we do that, we are doomed to repeat exactly the same mistakes that the previous generation did make.
Well, I think that's an appropriate place to close our conversation today. So I want to thank you very much for taking an hour of your time and spending it with our community and sharing your insights and your perspective. I know that we've all learned a lot today. I want to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. We will be sharing both the recording and the information about the panel that I mentioned earlier, that Ghaith will be participating with Israeli pollster Tamar Herman and other colleagues under the auspices of the Washington Institute. With that, I want to wish everybody a good day, and thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much, everyone.